Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating framework from the Hassin Center. We live in a world driven by deep faith, but also rapid scientific advancement, right? So how do human intellect and religious belief actually interact? It's a debate that's literally spanned centuries. What we're looking at today is a highly structured, analytical perspective on how these two powerful forces actually harmonize rather than clash.
We've structured this explainer into 5 distinct parts to walk through the logic. We'll start with the core of Islamic harmony, then look at why apparent contradictions arise. From there, we'll get into decoding the unseen and unusual, go over a practical guide to doubts, and finally wrap up with reason as a ladder.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, the core of Islamic harmony. The source tackles a question that has fascinated minds throughout history. How exactly do divine revelation and human reason work together? Think about it. It's the ultimate question, right? How do ancient, unchanging texts mesh with the ever-evolving intellectual thought of our modern world? When you're confronted with ancient wisdom and modern logic, do you have to pick a side? Or is there a way to seamlessly weave them together into one coherent worldview?
The whole foundation of this framework starts with the concept of submission. But, and this is a really important but, this source doesn't define submission as some kind of blind, unthinking faith. Not at all. It describes it as an active engagement rooted in evidence. There's a Quranic verse that states, "Whoever submits his face to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while he is a doer of good, then he has grasped the most trustworthy handholder." The source argues that this exact dynamic sets the stage for a humble yet intellectually rigorous approach to faith.
Here's the absolute crucial point the Hassin Center makes. Divine revelation and human intellect can never truly contradict. Why? Because the framework posits they are both gifts originating from the exact same source. The logic here is just incredibly elegant. The entity who revealed the texts is literally this very same entity who designed the human brain and its capacity for reason. So if we perceive a contradiction, it isn't a flaw in the system. It's just an illusion arising from our own misunderstanding.
Which brings us to part 2, why apparent contradictions arise.
If they don't actually contradict, why do so many people think they do? Well, the source outlines 5 specific psychological and academic traps that cause us to see a conflict where none exists. We've got inauthentic texts, misjudging reason, confusing the impossible with the unusual, confusing the bewildering with the impossible, and finally, misinterpreting texts. Don't just think of this as a list. It's honestly a fascinating roadmap of the mental roadblocks we hit when analyzing theology. Let's break them down.
Sometimes the root of the problem is just bad data. The first obstacle is inauthentic narrations. We're talking about dealing with texts that were wrongly attributed to the religion and just aren't actually part of Islam to begin with. Makes sense, right? If you try to reconcile flawless logic with a completely fabricated quote, you're obviously going to find a contradiction. That's exactly why scholars spend centuries painstakingly verifying the historical authenticity of these narrations. The source also points out a pretty wild double standard in how we judge reason. Think about science. We readily accept and measure intangibles all the time, things like temperature or the sheer speed of light. We can't hold them, but we believe in them. Yet when religion speaks of intangibles, like the weighing of deeds on Judgment Day, suddenly people want to label it irrational. The framework challenges this head-on. If we can logically accept intangible science, why do we automatically dismiss intangible faith? It argues the Creator is just far more capable than his creation.
Moving on to part 3, decoding the unseen and unusual. The source uses a brilliant historical analogy here. Imagine telling someone 1,000 years ago about a massive metal tube flying through the sky, or a glowing piece of glass that lets you talk to a friend across the ocean. They'd look at you like you were crazy and call it rationally impossible. But they'd be entirely wrong. They'd be confusing the merely unusual with the logically impossible. The text argues we often make this exact same mistake when we apply our modern intellect to divine revelation.
Fourth on the list, the framework separates the bewildering from the impossible. Let's take the concept of a creator hearing billions of simultaneous sounds without a single one distracting from another. Does that short-circuit the human mind? Absolutely. It's wildly bewildering to even try to comprehend. But the text argues that just because our brains don't have the capacity to fully grasp the mechanics of it, that doesn't make it logically impossible. Being amazed by something doesn't mean it can't be true. Finally, we often misinterpret texts by forcing earthly physics onto the unseen world. For instance, the text mentions descriptions of the angel Gabriel having 600 wings.
The source argues that judging this by earthly biological constraints is just a categorical error. It belongs to a completely different realm of reality, the unseen world of angels. Trying to apply the aerodynamic rules of a bird to an angelic being is literally just using the wrong intellectual tool for the job.
Okay, let's look at part 4, a practical guide to doubts. So what do you actually do when you hit a wall and experience a doubt? The source gives a really actionable 3-step guide. Step 1, be certain there is no real contradiction. Step 2, approach the matter with a sincere desire to understand, not just to win an argument. And Step 3, direct your questions to qualified scholars. Interestingly, the text explicitly advises against random internet searches because, let's be real, just like Googling a headache can quickly convince you have some rare disease, Googling complex theology without expertise usually just leads to way more confusion.
This whole structured approach is grounded in a specific Quranic instruction: ask the people of knowledge if you don't know. It's entirely about intellectual humility. The framework emphasizes seeking out uniquely qualified scholars, recognizing that these deeply intersectional topics require a lifetime of rigorous study. It is so much more productive to ask an expert than it is to dispute a profound concept with incomplete information.
And our final section, part 5, reason as a ladder.
The text concludes with a truly beautiful metaphor. It says that human intellect isn't meant to be a brick wall blocking us from the divine. Instead, it's meant to be a ladder. And just like any ladder, it requires active, intentional effort to climb. It's not passive. When used properly and humbly, reason actively deepens our understanding, and it harmonizes perfectly with revelation to lead us toward a stronger, much more resilient faith.
Which leaves us with a final thought to ponder. How do we apply our own reason when faced with the seemingly impossible in our daily lives? Really, how are you using your own intellect to shape your understanding of the world's most profound mysteries? It's a pretty powerful framework to reflect on. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I can't wait to unpack more fascinating sources with you next time.